Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. Tonight we will explore women's empowerment through politics. All too often, women identify themselves as codependent or depressed, and while personal examination is invaluable, there are economic and social forces at work that we cannot afford to address. Personal power in a political climate of disenfranchisement and economic barriers will only take us so far. 1995 was the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, awarding women the right to vote. The women's suffrage victory began in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention and was ratified in 1920. Many powerful women dedicated their lives to this cause, some of whom did not live to see it completed. Polls show that for some reason, women are underutilizing this hard-won right. The Republican takeover 2 years ago has been attributed by more than one political maven as occurring in part because women stayed home from the polls. Well, in a few months, we will have another chance. Tonight, we are fortunate to have Amy Brinkman-Vial and Juliana Brooks, charter founders of the Women's Recovery Roundtable, an advocacy group for women and children in recovery. Welcome. I want to thank you both for making time to come this evening and for your willingness to address something that's incredibly important. I think all too often, and as I had mentioned in the opening, we do have a strong emphasis on doing personal recovery, personal growth, and I know as social workers, I think you both have your MSW, don't you? As social workers, you obviously come from a perspective of looking at the larger climate, larger perspective, and seeing things in context. So that's another reason we're particularly fortunate to have you. Now, part of what you do with the Women's Recovery Roundtable is advocate at, I believe, different levels in the county. Can you tell us a little bit about this organization?
Well, the Women's Recovery Roundtable is an advocacy group for women and children in issues around recovery, and we broadly define what recovery is, so I want to make that perfectly clear. But we advocate at the levels of, social policy in terms of locally, and issues that are affecting women and children, statewide, and some national issues. So, but basically starting grassroots in our own backyards, in our own community right here in Santa Clara County.
Okay. So part of your commitment is that part of actual change happens by people actually showing up and participating. I hear so many people say, why bother? They get discouraged at the system. I have no doubt that you certainly probably have a reaction to the latest in welfare reform bills and the consequences to our county for women and children. How are you able to maintain a belief that a single woman participating still matters?
Well, I guess because I've found that for myself, I've had that experience, and that's something that I continue to learn. Knowing that you can make a difference comes when you see change, and I think we've had to learn to start with very small change and look for very general trends and small increments instead of expecting to overhaul the whole system towards what women's needs are all at once. Attacking a specific thing. And it can be hard, I think, for a woman to really believe that she could do something different or make a difference in a system or in an issue that is important to her. But that's what we found in the roundtable. When we get together, we can do that. And we have a lot more resources together than separate.
Okay. So we're really looking at the importance of combining our resources.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when we were talking about this show at one point, I did some research and I read a book about the women, one woman, one vote, and looking at the history of the suffragette movement, which was fabulous. And out of that, there was a list from the 1915 suffragette movement on reasons why women should vote. And I found this fascinating. And one of the things I'd like to do tonight is take a look at these different reasons and look at how relevant they still are today in 1996. So let's take a look at the first three and see what we see. Alrighty. Because those who obey the laws should help to choose those who make the laws. That's the first reason women should vote. Secondly, because laws affect women as much as men. And thirdly, because laws which affect women are now passed without consulting them. Now, theoretically, the last one strikes me as not as absolutely true, and yet, when we look at the makeup of our Congress
Right.
and our Senate, do either one of you happen to know, I don't know off the top of my head what the representation is. I know it's less than 20%. So the reality is that even though we have the right to vote, in terms of actual political voice, in your experience, how much do women actually say in the political system?
Well, we have the right to vote, but we lack the representation, you know, and in terms of women that represent us, other women, or women's issues, children's issues, and I still think today that, you know, to a lesser extent, laws are passed without consulting women about how they'll affect their lives and the lives of their children, or they're passed without really, you know, they're not well thought out. They're not thought through in terms of, you know, I mean, you talked about disenfranchisement in the beginning. It's like, you know, when you're worrying and struggling just to survive, feed your children, to have a home over your head, you know, voting probably seems like a far out, you know, a distant, it's not a priority.
That's a good point.
You know,
That's a
so-
good point. So part of that struggling allows us from feeling like we actually may deprive us of the energy to even participate.
Exactly.
Okay.
And is that a tactic? You know what I mean? I mean, you know, who knows? But it's certainly a reality,
Yeah.
you know. And especially in Santa Clara County where, you know, the rents are disproportionately higher than, you know, areas around, you know, in California. I mean, it's just outrageous
That's
what
true.
people struggle just to keep their roofs over their heads. So when they're worrying about day-to-day things, you know, it's just like voting seems like, you know, not important.
Right. Right.
And I think that adds to an already difficult thing with a woman trying to make a change in a system that started originally out of men planning it. And I don't mean that to sound, you know, feminist or too strong, but if men were only involved in voting at first, I mean, the system worked for what they were doing then, and there weren't the same kind of issues of women re-entering the workforce and women to working parents in a family, or maybe the same rate of divorce or other problems, child raising, daycare, all those kinds of things that weren't thought of, like Juliana said.
Okay.
And you know, the other thing, I guess, that number two is because laws affect women as much as men. In fact, some laws affect women much more. And look at the legislation that's happening right now around welfare. It's going to, again, affect women more dramatically and children more dramatically than it will men. It will affect men as well, but it will affect more women and children than it will men. And so, and how many women have had a voice in creating that? Probably not that many.
Well,
And I don't-
particularly since it was designed at the House level.
Right.
And again, if we look at the houses, that, you know, there just isn't that kind of representation.
Right.
So that's right. How many women were involved with structuring that federal legislation? Frightening thought. Okay, let's take a look at the next three, or two. Let's see. Because laws affecting children should include the woman's point of view as well as the man's, and because laws affecting the home are voted on in every session of the legislation. Now, when this pamphlet was originally created, the writer took a lot of, Jane Addams actually was her name, and she took a lot of flack because her tactic for getting men to accept the women's vote was to emphasize the woman's role in the home rather than to de-emphasize it. So by saying, you know, sort of reminding, in a way, subliminally men, that yes, as women, we still are going to have this primary role. Okay, so I don't know how that first hit you when you saw it, but that is sort of the history of the emphasis on home.
Right.
That she had. Because part of the objection was, well, then we'll have women running amok, running this country, and we certainly can't have that. So by sort of quieting fears by both men and women,
Right.
about women voting. I mean, it simply wasn't just men who were afraid of women having the vote. It's very much also women. And that's still true today. I mean, we certainly have I'm sure, certainly you encounter, in your experience, women who are not women's advocates. I mean, just because we shared, you know, kind of the same genetic build doesn't necessarily mean we have the same political agenda.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that has a lot to do with roles, too, is some women have a variety of roles, and some women have become more accustomed to being the provider or being a single parent or doing different things than other women that have a more traditional role as the mother in the home, staying home, raising the children, keeping the house, those kinds of things. And that's a slow adjustment. Even among women, there's dissension and confusion about, well, why would somebody want to do this or that? And I think what we try to look at in the roundtable is issues that affect the availability of the opportunity, that if somebody wants to, they can have that option. And when we see issues that come up, we try to be involved in them.
Okay.
Especially there can be issues for pregnant women, for instance.
Yes.
And this one talked about issues affecting children,
Yeah, should
include the woman's view, especially as the mother who was the primary caregiver initially when this was written, and most times, or many times, is still now.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to include in that. It's like the theory still applies. The situation may be a little different now in the, more modern world, but the problems are still the same, and the change still needs to happen.
And it strikes me how similar that this still is.
Right.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, 1915, 1995, and 1996.
And Jane Addams was a social worker, and she created the Hull House. And Jane Addams was a woman, beyond her time. I mean, she had some radical ideas, but she took a lot of flack throughout her whole career. And I hadn't realized that these were written by Jane Addams, or she had a part in this. And I just think that you talked about women who we've seen women who don't come at things the same way or don't support things. And I think some of that it does depend on the role, and some of that is that internalized oppression from living in a culture that is dominated from a male perspective. And it's a sort of trickle down effect in living. I mean, it's we look at legislation that affects women negatively, and we live in a world that's ruled by these kind of legislations. And so, how do we view ourselves? What is our view of ourselves? Powerless, hopeless. How can we affect change for our children or for the 7th generation if we feel powerless in our own right now, here and now?
And that I'm sorry to interrupt you because we need to take a break.
Okay.
And again, that's the focus of tonight, which is how to get that power back,
Right.
and not be sitting in that position.
Right.
Stay tuned. When we return, we'll learn more about exercising this power. Stay with us.
The reason I vote as a woman is because I have the freedom to do so in this country. I like to express